Greetings. In this lecture, I want to look at the ample constitutional powers of the French president, and I want to make some comparisons in this lecture between the powers of the French president and those of the American president. And from time to time, I'll go back and make some reminders about powers of British prime ministers. So, in many ways, the French president has a lot of powers and a lot of responsibilities that look like an American president. And you can kind of look through the listing of powers that are in the notes. But both of them are the head of state or chief of state. Both the French president and the American president represent the country, right? Both of them perform ceremonial tasks. Both of them symbolize national unity. So both the American president and the French president play this role of head of state or chief of state. Very, very different, remember, than in Great Britain. In Great Britain, the chief of state is not a formal political officer. The chief of state in Great Britain is Queen Elizabeth. So Queen Elizabeth plays the role of head of state, while the chief executive is the prime minister. So in the case of an American president, we have fused the dignity of royal to the working powers of a chief executive. And so they look alike in that way. They are both commander-in-chief of the military, which looks the same, as is the French prime minister, for example. There are some significant differences between them. The one area where the French president looks weaker is that the French president lacks the power of a veto. Remember, the Prime Minister of Great Britain also does not have the power of the veto. But that's not a big deal in either of those countries, because in the United States, the president needs the veto because the American Congress is so powerful. The American Congress is one of the few national legislatures in the world that can say no to a chief executive, to a president, and make it stick on an ongoing basis. In Britain, the House of Commons is very compliant. Nearly 97% of the government, the Prime Minister and Cabinet's legislation, has been passed into law. The percentage isn't quite as high in the French case. It's about 87%, but it is very, very high, and the president can expect to get his legislative agenda through the National Assembly in France. An American president cannot make that assumption. An American president is limited to 2 4-year terms, and the American president has a lifetime term limit, meaning if they serve their 2 4-year terms, or if, for example, they become president because a president has died or resigned and they're the vice president, in theory, an American president can serve up to 10 years. In France, the term limit is longer, 5 years per term instead of 4. And in France, the limit is 2 consecutive term limits, meaning that a French president can serve 10 consecutive years, can step away from the presidency for a term, and then can come back and can be president again for 2 terms. And a good example of this occurring is in Russia. On paper, Russia has this semi-presidential system, although Putin has corrupted it and hijacked it, and has actually kind of turned into being the dictator of Russia. But this is what Putin did. Putin was the president for 2 terms. He then stepped down, and his hand-picked successor served for 1 term. His successor appointed Mr. Putin to be the premier, or the prime minister. Political powers were then shifted to the prime minister, so Putin kept his power. And then when that term was up, Mr. Putin became president again, and political powers were shifted back to the president. So uh, in France and in Russia, there are term limits, but they're consecutive terms. That just means that you have to step out for one term. Now, I do want to make a comment about the letter B that's in your notes, which says 5-year term of office with 2 consecutive terms. Originally, there were 7-year terms with no term limits. And the notes say French leaders routinely win re-election, and only 2 have ever lost, D'Estaing and Sarkozy. Probably should be amended a little bit. I mean, one of the things you may want to write is that even though it is true only 2 French presidents have lost bids for re-election, it's a little bit misleading, because the president before Mr. Macron, Mr. Hollande, did not seek re-election. He was the first president in the history of the Fifth Republic to not seek re-election. And so, you know, yeah, even though 2 and only 2 have lost, 1 also did not seek re-election. Now, there are some unique powers that belong to the French president that the Prime Minister of Britain doesn't have, and obviously the American president doesn't have. The president names the premier and other cabinet offices. Now, I'm going to go into more detail later about that, but essentially that choice needs to be ratified or confirmed by the National Assembly. But the president selects that person. The president appoints 3 of the 9 members, not 3 or 9 members. It's 3 of the 9 members to the Constitutional Council. A couple of powers that leap off the page to me. One is emergency powers, right? Article 16 of the French Constitution is very explicit. It states that when the institutions of the Republic, the independence of the nation, and the integrity of its territory are threatened in a grave and immediate manner, and when the regular functioning of the constitutional government authorities is interrupted, the president shall take the measures commanded by these circumstances. This was most famously used by Charles de Gaulle during the Algerian crisis in 1961. But there was a terrorist attack in Paris in November of 2015, and the French president used this emergency power to briefly invoke emergency powers. Now, even though we don't have this in the U.S. Constitution, look at the extraordinary measures that President Trump has taken, basically emergency powers. Certainly, we saw this in Great Britain when World War II occurred. Remember, in Britain, elections were suspended until the war was over. So it is very, very typical in countries that during times of emergency, there is a lot of power vested in the executive. The president, like the British Prime Minister, can dissolve the legislature, the House of Commons, or the National Assembly. But the biggest difference, and if you look at letter G in your notes, the president of France, when he dissolves the National Assembly and when he calls for new elections, which he can do once a year, unlike the British Prime Minister, he does not put his seat at risk, and that is a big difference. The president can also propose constitutional amendments, which must be ratified by the legislature and ratified by a national referendum. And this referendum power of the French president is very, very significant. So the French president can reach out directly to the people. He can tell them that I have an idea. Ultimately, you, the people, have this power vested in you. And I want you to consider my idea and to ratify it. there's a couple words missing under K, referendum power. It states 1962, de Gaulle got direct, and you should add the word election. De Gaulle got direct election of the president this way. Before 1962, when de Gaulle first had the French Constitution drafted, the president was elected by this cumbersome institution called the Electoral College. Once de Gaulle was elected president, he decided that he really didn't like this, that it had been a mistake in the Constitution that he had drafted. And so he went to the people and said, let's get rid of the Electoral College and have direct election of the president. And the French voters overwhelmingly voted to have direct election of the president. And so that is the most famous of the referendum that has existed in France during the Fifth Republic. It is the most noteworthy change, and it occurred in a referendum. Note L, the budgetary dominance. This is a huge difference between the French system and the American political system. The French National Assembly is a part-time legislature. They only meet for 2 very short sessions during the year, and as a result, the National Assembly cannot propose any amendments increasing expenditures or decreasing revenues. The National Assembly only has, think about this, 70 days to defeat a budget. And if they're unable to defeat the budget, or if they're unable to agree on a budget, the president's budget passes by decree. And of course, like an American president, the French president has the power of the pardon and the reprieve. When I take a look at the French president constitutionally versus the American president, the powers obviously that stand out, the first one is the referendum power. About half of American states have, in fact, it's a little bit more than half. At the state level, we have the referendum power. For example, in the state of California, the state legislature can place a measure on the ballot for the voters to vote for or against. It's direct democracy in the sense that it is the people who ultimately have the final say. But at the state level, many of our states allow for legislation to be placed on the ballot for voters to decide. In America, however, there is no mechanism for the president or even for the Congress to place a measure on the ballot for us to vote for. So the French do have this provision of direct democracy called the referendum, and in the United States, we don't have that power. The referendum power is something that exists in some cities, it exists in some states, it does not exist at the national level. The second thing that stands out in this list of powers is this formal acknowledgement of emergency powers. And to me, that suggests the historical legacy of France. During a time of crisis, you need strong and decisive executive leadership to overcome the crisis, and certainly the crises that faced the Third Republic, for example, responding to Hitler during the Rhineland crisis, comes to mind as something where you would want the president to have very, very strong executive leadership. And of course, the third one is that French presidents have term limits, 2 5-year terms, but unlike the United States that has a lifetime term limit on our presidents, the French only have a consecutive term limit. So a French president can serve for 10 years, could step away for a term, and then could come back and become president again. Now, that's not as good as the British Prime Minister, right? The British Prime Minister has no term limits at all, and in theory could win again and again and again. But even the 2 superstars of British political history since World War II, the tenure of Thatcher and Blair, they were only there for about 10 years when they had to step down.